We're going to start the meeting as we usually do in person with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And if you don't want to stand, it's okay because we'll end up looking at your belly. But if you want to, I think I will because I just feel weird doing the Pledge of Allegiance sitting down. So if you'll join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States
of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay.
Well, if Charlie gets his mic unmuted, we'll hear from him. But if not, on behalf of Charlie, welcome everybody. And just want to let you know that we're going to do this again next month as well. I thought I'd introduce next month's speaker. The meeting will be on January 7th. That's the first Thursday, which, by the way, is Millard Fillmore's birthday for you history buffs. And our guest will be John Mcmanus. Dr. Mcmanus spoke to our group, I was going to say last year, but believe it or not, that was this year. That was January. That seemed like a long time ago. But in January, Dr. Mcmanus will be talking about his book on D-Day, which is called The Dead and Those About to Die, D-Day, the Big Red One in Omaha Beach. And several of us from the group Roundtable saw him speak on that topic at Gettysburg last year, I believe it was, and I think you're in for a treat. So that's Thursday, January 7th. And since Frederick is here, I guess we'll proceed with introducing tonight's guest. And I had the pleasure of talking with Jared last week just to introduce myself, and we have a lot in common. He's a historian, author, and he also, prior to his teaching career, which he's doing now, he served as a park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park, which is my second home, as well as Harper's Ferry National Historical Park. Tonight he's going to be talking about his book on D-Day, Dispatches of D-Day, A People's History of the Normandy Invasion. And Jared also recently co-authored a book with Eric Dorr, who's the owner and curator of the Museum of American History in Gettysburg. And I don't know if you've ever been there. If you haven't, it's one of the most interesting and unusual museums I've ever visited. And a big part of that museum is Eric's collection of relics related to Major Dick Winters. He's assembled quite a collection. And the book that Jared co-wrote with Eric is called Hang Tough, the World War II Letters and Artifacts of Major Dick Winters. And it will feature a lot of things from the collection. When we resume our in-person meetings, whenever that is, Jared has agreed to come back and give a talk on that book. And perhaps we can persuade Eric to drive up from Gettysburg and co-present with him. That's our hope. So that'll be coming up, something to look forward to. Again, a lot of things to look forward to. But as tonight, I'm just going to turn it over to Jared. And Jared, again, thank you for being our guinea pig, and welcome to the Central Pennsylvania World War II Roundtable.
Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you to all of you for having me for your inaugural digital presentation. That's very exciting. And I'm even more excited by the fact that you picked me before John Mcmanus to be your guinea pig for this presentation. So I am pleased to be the warm-up band for John Mcmanus for your next presentation. I am indeed honored, and I'm so pleased to see you all. I know we're not all together in a physical sense, but we're here together in the digital world, and that's the best that we can do during these days of isolation. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up my PowerPoint slide. When I'm in the classroom, I try to be a very visual teacher, and I attempt to bring out and evoke that same sort of imagery and passion that I do in the classroom. And so my book came out last year. It's entitled Dispatches of D-Day, and it came out just in time for the 75th anniversary. And I take a somewhat different perspective. When I told people that I was writing a book about D-Day, a lot of people kind of shrugged and they said, what could you possibly write that is new about D-Day? It's like writing a book about Gettysburg. what else could be written? And as I quickly found out, there was a lot to be written about. And I posed the situation to my students in this way. A lot of them, of course, me teaching at Penn State Altoona, a lot of them go to Penn State football games. And Beaver Stadium is the second largest stadium in the United States. It can hold about 110,000 people. And I tell them, picture Beaver Stadium on a full game day, and then picture another 50,000 people tailgating outside, and you have equivalent the number of Allied participants in the opening phase of the Normandy invasion. And when you put it in a concept in which they can relate to like that, it just astounds them. And each one of those 160,000 participants had a story to tell. Not all of them were interviewed about it. Not all of them wrote books. Not all of them are featured in movies. But nonetheless, each one of them had a story. And tonight, I'm going to share some of those stories with you that I found in my research, where I was able to resurrect voices of the Normandy invasion that have not been heard in 3/4 of a century. And our story begins in a somewhat unlikely place, in the streets of Austin, Texas. There was a young student from the University of Texas by the name of Horace Busby, who worked for the student newspaper there at that college. And he and his classmates were up late studying. It was a rainy night. They were preparing for final examinations. And around 4:30 in the morning, this voice crackled over the radio in their study halls that announced at long last the Normandy invasion had begun. And Horace Busby, who wrote this wonderful article in the student newspaper, summed up the emotion that was universally felt in communities all across the country that Tuesday night. And he said roommates were rolled out of bed, lights snapped on as fast as word could be screamed down hallways, telephones began to ring, and a rain-drenched Austin came to life. And you could insert Hershey or Lancaster or Altoona or Baltimore in exchange for the word Austin in that sentence, and it would still apply. Americans knew that this event was coming, they just did not know when. And so one angle of my book is to look at not only the battlefront, but often the overlooked efforts and emotions of people on the home front as well. In another way, our story begins where for so many it ended, and that is the Normandy American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer on the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. I've had the privilege of visiting this place on a number of occasions, but most poignant was my first visit there in March of 2013. It was spring break. I was traveling with a group of students to visit the various historical sites in Normandy, and we had the misfortune of visiting France during the largest snowstorm in a century, which greatly hindered our travel and our agenda and prevented us from visiting a lot of the sites that we hoped to tour. But nonetheless, it was still a wonderful trip. And by the last day of our excursion, much of the snow had melted. The Normandy American Cemetery had opened. It was very rainy and dreary, though. And after we walked around and the students gave some presentations, many of them returned to the warmth and dryness of the visitor center. And by and large, I was left alone here among the nearly 10,000 tombstones of that cemetery. There was not a single other soul in sight. It was me and it was them. And the emotions of this moment were heightened even more so for me because it was 20 years to the day that my grandfather had passed away. My grandfather was a veteran of the 4th Infantry Division. He landed on Utah Beach on D-Day. And it's really one of the great regrets of my life that I never had the opportunity to talk with him about his wartime experiences. He passed away when I was only 5 years old. And to be there on that day, on the anniversary of his death, made this even more profound for me. And even though I never really got to know him in the manner that I wished, I realized how lucky I was, because my grandfather lived 49 years longer than all of these men buried under these white stars and crosses. And it made me feel very fortunate that I had him for the time that I did. And indeed, it is stories like these that drew me to the enduring power that the Normandy battlefront has in our memory. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, as Americans walked out onto their front porches in their night robes, this is what they often found on their sidewalks. Big, bold lettering announcing the long-awaited invasion. Some newspapers even rolled out the special red ink that they only used for notable occasions to highlight the momentous nature of this event. And in another way, the story of my book begins in a dumpster. And allow me to explain the story behind that. One day I had a student come into my class with a pile of yellowed newspapers from the war years. And he explained to me that an older neighbor of his had passed away, and the family members were throwing everything out, and on top of the dumpster was this pile of newspapers. And he went and salvaged them, and he brought them into me, knowing that I liked old stuff like this, is how he phrased it. And I was amazed by the level of material and information that were found in wartime newspapers. Newspapers of the 1940s, as some of you even well may remember, are practically double the size of what newspapers are today. And this prompted a quest of mine to uncover, what was the American experience in regard to D-Day? How did people react to it? How did they endure it? How did they survive it? How did they cope with its losses? And I started to go through various newspaper archives, many of which have been digitized just in the past few years. And this opens all sorts of new doors for historians like myself. And over the course of the next year, I transcribed 300,000 words in newspaper articles that were talking about the Normandy invasion. And those firsthand accounts, written in the moment, became the basis for my book, Dispatches of D-Day. So that is the beginning for my story. And among the most frequently used newspapers that I referred to is a wonderful military publication that is still in print today called Stars and Stripes. And for those veterans who are watching the program tonight, you very well may have read Stars and Stripes in your own time. But prior to the invasion, Stars and Stripes made the issue very clear to its military readers. And it said this: "The quest to self-educate will in itself make you a better informed soldier, a better educated American. And in the days ahead, when it becomes your job to help decide issues on which the future all depends, your knowledge of the big picture will make you a better citizen, and in a small way will help make this a better world." And behind this quotation is an urgent desire for soldiers to be literate, to be well informed, to be aware of the international situation and the role that America was going to play in the world once victory was ultimately obtained. And the access to information, a celebration of literacy, and a celebration of the free press is what American soldiers saw as one of the core underpinnings of the democracy that they were trying to save. And so that became a repetitive theme in a lot of the accounts that I found in these period newspapers. And this was a learning opportunity for service members who found themselves in the various staging areas of Great Britain between December of 1943 and June of 1944, especially among war reporters and correspondents. Many of you very well may recognize the young gentleman who is pictured on the lower left, a young man who got his beginnings as a staff writer with Stars and Stripes. That young man is Andy Rooney of future 60 Minutes fame. This is where he got his start in journalism. And Andy Rooney wrote these very colorful articles, not only about the American air war over Europe, but how Americans were interacting with their new allies in Great Britain. And among them, he was, I think someone has their microphone on. Could you double check to make sure? Okay, thank you very much. And he wrote of these, particular Americans who realized that some of the items that they were issued, such as Lucky Strike cigarettes, Hershey chocolate bars, and Wrigley spearmint gum, carried their weight in gold in war-rationed England. And he called one particular breed of rather flirtatious American as Piccadilly Commandos, who needed to satisfy their interest, shall we say. And as a result of all of that, there were 20,000 Anglo-American babies born in the months leading up to and after the Normandy invasion. To this very day, this incursion of Americans is still called the friendly invasion. Sometimes it got a little bit too friendly. And the British had a common saying about their American allies, and that phrase was that the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. To which the Americans had a rebuttal where they said that the British were underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. And so that was the timely rhetorical pushback that they offered to their British allies as preparations were underway. Not everything suggests a unified front, though, especially in regard to racial issues, because, of course, at this time, the American military is still segregated, and it would remain so until the year 1948. And this provided an opportunity for Black service members who were in the United States Armed Forces, because they rightfully believed that if they served with dignity and heroism, that it would pave the way for broader civil rights that could be earned at home after the war. And of course, as we see with the civil rights movement after the conflict, that is ultimately what occurred. Among the chief proponents of this was a Pennsylvania newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the largest read African-American newspaper in America at that time. It had a subscription of about 250,000 readers. And the Pittsburgh Courier established what became known as the Double V campaign. Victory at overseas would mean victory at home, a greater sense of justice and civil rights. These were hard earned, though, in some cases, because as one African-American sergeant later said, we Black troops went overseas to fight the Germans, but we had to fight the Yanks first. This was especially so in Great Britain, where there was no segregation, there was no Jim Crow, there was no color line. And sadly enough, some Black soldiers felt more at home and better treated in a foreign country than what they did in their own nation. And so these were going to be rights that they were fighting for. And the same is true, too, of women who were interacting or participating in military service in one form or another. And so, too, of female correspondents. One particular person who I read about in my research was a writer for Collier's Weekly magazine by the name of Martha Gellhorn, who had to overcome all sorts of obstacles to navigate her way through the male-dominated worlds of the press and military bureaucracy. And as she very defiantly said to one of her military chaperones or overseers, is that it is necessary that I report on this war it is necessary that I see for those who cannot see for themselves. And her greatest obstacle along the way was her own husband, the gentleman pictured here in the top right-hand corner, whose name is Ernest Hemingway, who worked for the same magazine and who saw his wife not as a partner, but as competition. And Ernest Hemingway was doing everything in his power to make sure that he was the one who got the big scoop on the Normandy invasion and not his wife. So we'll revisit Martha Gellhorn a little bit later, and we're going to see if she's ultimately successful in her quest to cover the forthcoming invasion. Now, as to the invasion date itself, this too was a point of contention, because if you were to ask somebody in the Army Air Forces in the spring of 1944 when the invasion was going to be, they would have told you it's already begun, because starting in 1943, the 8th Air Force started bombing military installations in France and industrial plants in both Norway and Germany and elsewhere. And this was a point that General Hap Arnold really stressed to reporters that spring. He said, "We are invading, and not at some remote beachhead. We are hitting the enemy where he lives. He knows if he cannot stop us, he is licked." And as many of you are well aware, the conditions that these members of the Air Forces had to confront were sometimes just as abysmal as frontline troops. Flying at 50,000 feet at temperatures 50 below zero, where you could get frostbite if you took off your glove. What is lesser known about the 8th Air Force is that that entity suffered more casualties in the skies over Europe than what the Marine Corps lost in the entirety of the Pacific War throughout the duration of that conflict. And so that was a huge point that members of the Air Forces were trying to stress, that the invasion was already on. In a more immediate sense, though, the preparation undertaken to initiate the largest amphibious operation in history was nothing less than biblical. And I think that this photograph here, more than any other, helps underscore just how large of an undertaking that was. This is a port in Devon, England, taken 5 days before D-Day. And as one reporter summed up this mass accumulation of material supplies, he defined it as a mechanical Niagara. He said it was like Niagara Falls, but instead of water, picture like the endless stream of crates and vehicles and boxes and shipments of supplies and vehicles. He said it was absolutely endless. And something interesting that I found in a Pennsylvania newspaper of this time is that here in our Commonwealth, the Pennsylvania War Manpower Commission for the year 1944 said that it needed to cut down 400 billion board feet of timber in order to prepare for the shipping and packaging of all of this invasion material to go overseas for the Normandy invasion. Just imagine that, 400 billion board feet of wood for all of these crates that needed to be constructed. It is absolutely astounding. One of the other workhorses of the military effort we see here in the background as well, in the form of LSTs, standing for landing ship tanks. And a lot of those were created in the Drevaux shipyards, not too far away from Pittsburgh. And these were multiple use vehicles. Hatch doors would open at the bow, allowing service members to take supplies and vehicles literally from ship to shore. And later on, General Eisenhower credited those vessels as one of the 5 key ingredients that led to ultimate Allied victory in 1945. And speaking of General Eisenhower, at face value, he was very calm, cool, and confident about what was on the horizon. I think behind the scenes, though, he was perhaps a little bit more shaken by the responsibilities that had been placed on him. And as reporter Ann O'Hare McCormick of the New York Times said of General Eisenhower and his fellow generals, "Never has the fate of so many depended on the judgment of so few." Another reporter said that it seemed like each one of those stars on Eisenhower's shoulder, it seemed like each of them weighed a ton. This was the burden of command. And Eisenhower, he was smoking 4 or 5 packs of cigarettes a day to help cope with this stress, something that would give him a heart attack just 11 years down the road while he was living in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And he was a man, though, who prepared for every contingency. And we can get a good sense of that from this letter that he composes the day before the invasion. And in short, what that letter stresses is that he takes full responsibility for the failure of Operation Overlord. He says the armed services, they did everything within their power. The fault, the guilt, the responsibility, it rests with me. And that is what made him such an effective leader. He was certainly willing to take a degree of credit for his successes, but he was not going to let somebody else be the fall guy. He was the supreme Allied commander, and if this massive undertaking was going to fail, that was a reflection on him more than anything else. He was a man who never saw combat. Rather, his skills lied in his ability to negotiate and to delegate. And those same skills in regards to being able to compromise with people and facilitate conversation is subsequently also what made him an effective commander-in-chief, in my view. But thankfully, the document that is released to the press is not that previous one, but the one that we now see on our screens, a far better known address that I like to call the Gettysburg Address of 1944. It's a little bit over 200 words. It is Dwight Eisenhower's order of the day. And this is where we see a morally driven Eisenhower emerge. And I found endlessly, without fail, this speech was on the front page of every newspaper in America on June 6, 1944. And the reason why I like to refer to it as the Gettysburg Address of 1944 is because it uses the same sort of moral rhetoric to inspire soldiers, sailors, and airmen, as well as a nation and the international community that made up the Allied forces. Eisenhower, like Lincoln 80-some years earlier, said that this is a contest for the ages. We are in a struggle for a vast future, and generations that have not even been born yet, their lives and their freedom rests on you, the common GI. And those are incredibly powerful words when you take a step back and reflect upon them. And indeed, these are words that Eisenhower's forces took to heart. So I'm sure I'm not telling you anything here that you don't already know. This is the single map that I have in my book, though. My book is not a book about strategy or command decisions. It is a story about people consumed by this great contest. It is a boots on the ground perspective. All that said, though, it's good to offer readers a little bit of geographic context. And of course, there are 5 beaches, 2 American, 2 British, and the British one is bookended by a Canadian sector. The beaches themselves stretch about a 50-mile front. Those 160,000 Allied troops will be facing off with approximately 50,000 German defenders. Eisenhower chose this location because it was the least likely, he thought, in which an invasion would usually occur, and this was to catch the Germans off guard. This vast armada of 7,000 ships crosses the English Channel at its largest break, the largest section separating Great Britain from the European continent, versus having them cross at the Pas de Calais, which is the shortest. And of course, one of the main objectives by landing here in Normandy is to capture the port of Cherbourg, one of the few deep water ports located in Europe that will thereafter become one of the main supply depots and offloading areas for the great campaigns that still await these Allied troops. And ultimately, that invasion begins in the earliest hours of June 6th. 13,000 paratroopers who are aboard several hundred aircraft comprised of American, British, French, and Canadian forces will be dropped behind enemy lines. I don't know if any of you have ever gone parachuting before, but it is a terrifying experience in and of itself, let alone doing so at night at 700 feet in pitch black darkness while people are shooting at you and the fields below you have been flooded. It never ceases to amaze me what these paratroopers and glider troops did in these hours before H hour. It is just absolutely astounding. Most of them had 110 pounds of equipment on them. And then, of course, they have to navigate their way through the absolute darkness to help clear the way for the amphibious forces that will land only 5 or 6 hours from that point. And this painting here, I think, very much accurately captures the intensity of that moment as the first Allied troops arrive behind enemy lines. And among those soldiers landing behind enemy lines is a rather colorful platoon of men with the 101st Airborne, who were known as the Filthy 13. These were a small group of men who were somehow, in the months preceding, able to avoid typical military protocol and discipline. They lived outdoors. They didn't live in barracks. They carried Bowie knives and brass knuckles and improvised weapons. They shaved their heads Mohawk style. They put war paint on as they were loading the C-47s to prepare their journey. They had not bathed since the month of December 1943 because they wanted to live it rough and prepare for battlefield conditions accordingly. And Stars and Stripes summed up this colorful assortment of men best when they wrote, "Pity the poor Nazi who encounters them." And indeed, these men gathered quite a tally on the Normandy battlefront and elsewhere in the ensuing weeks. These men have a rather unique pop cultural legacy. Many of you are undoubtedly fans of the 1967 movie, The Dirty Dozen. And there are scenes within that movie where they refuse to bathe and they refuse to shave and they're up to all sorts of shenanigans. The Dirty Dozen is based very, very loosely on the Filthy 13, and quite a story it is. As the sun begins to slowly rise up and try to peek through the otherwise, dark skies that day, the sight that awaited German outposts and coastal guards boggled the imagination. As the fog lifted and as those defenders looked through their binoculars, the sight awaiting them was unlike anything that they had ever beheld. And one naval captain, I think, summed it up best in this moment of jubilation and astonishment. And this picture here that we see just gives us a small taste of the undertaking. This picture was taken a few days later. But Captain Herschel West said this of this spectacle. And he noted, "One could use all the adjectives such as colossal, magnificent, stupendous, marvelous, greatest, immense, and still not give any idea of the number of men and material being moved." This was unlike anything the world had ever seen before, and in all likelihood, we are never going to see it again. This was a massive endeavor. And something else surprising, too, that I found is that the majority of the ships were not American, but rather British vessels. The British outnumbered American vessels by, like 3-2, and so that was something else very interesting that I was able to find in my research. But just look at that. What an image. Absolutely unbelievable. And in talking about some of these sailors and seaborne troops, I uncovered one of my favorite stories that I uncovered in my book. And it sounds made up, so I ask you to bear with me as I tell it. But sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. There was a young sailor from Wyoming whose name was Lawrence Patman. And he was an operator of a landing craft that was taking infantry troops ashore. And he noticed that these infantrymen had smuggled a small cur dog aboard with them, a dog that was their unit mascot, a dog that they picked up out of the gutters of London. And the dog's name was Muffin. Shortly thereafter, that landing craft suffered a direct hit. Men were blown sky high. Many of them were eviscerated by the impact of the shell that landed squarely on their boat. Patman is thrown into the air. He lands in the water. He fades in and out of consciousness. And when he finally comes to, he tries to lift his hand to swim to some nearby debris. And he finds that his hand has swollen to the size of a football. And he can't really swim. And he thinks in that moment, this is it. I'm going to drown here in the English Channel. No one's ever going to know what happened to me. And then, ultimately, his salvation was announced with a dog's bark. Muffin, this dog, had survived the blast, was likewise floating around in the water. Patman recalled the dog's name, and he called out, "Here, Muffin, here, boy." And this sailor later recalled to a reporter, he said, "I'll be damned if the dog didn't come over and start licking my face." And with his good arm, Patman put his arm over the back of the dog, and the dog served as an improvised flotation device to keep him above the waves until a rescue boat finally came and scooped them both out of the English Channel. And as Patman later recalled to a reporter, he said, "That mutt saved my life." Which I think is one of the most incredible D-Day stories that I've found. It almost sounds like a Disney movie. But like I said, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Among the first troops ashore were those men of the 4th Infantry Division, of which my grandfather was a part. And I would sometimes make the argument that the 4th Infantry Division doesn't get the credit that it often deserves. And I don't merely say that because I have family bias, but because the troops of the 4th Infantry Division felt that way themselves that June. Because as the weeks and days passed, after they pushed off of Utah Beach, which we can see here in these photographs, the men of the Ivy Division felt that they were not getting their due credit in newspapers and battlefield reports. They were reading about Omaha Beach. They were reading about airborne heroics behind the lines. And they started writing letters to the editor in complaint. And as this quote here from Stars and Stripes says in response, "The boys of the Ivy Division heard that a lot of people were getting credit for the Allied advances in France. That is, almost everybody but the 4th. And so Stars and Stripes issued an apology on paper here. And it just goes to show, once again, the importance of newspapers at this time. The GIs had an expectation that if they were serving with distinction, if they were doing well and advancing, they wanted to read about it in the newspapers. And they wanted other people to know about it as well. Once more underscoring the importance that these periodicals had to soldiers on the front line. But perhaps, of course, another reason why the exploits on Utah Beach, which were among the most successful on D-Day, among the reasons why they are overlooked is because of the carnage in contrast to that on Omaha Beach. there are about 200 casualties inflicted on Utah Beach. By comparison, there are 2,000 casualties that are inflicted on Omaha Beach. And of course, these moments are very accurately depicted in the first half hour of the movie Saving Private Ryan. In reality, though, many troops were stranded on that beach for 8 hours. And John Mcmanus will be talking about this to you at your next meeting, no doubt. And there were at least 2 reporters that I could find that were there among the opening waves of the advance. One of them was named Don Whitehead, who worked for the Associated Press, who gained the nickname Beachhead Don because of his battlefield durability. And also Robert Capa, a Hungarian-born photographer who worked for Life magazine at this time. And these 2 men chronicled the chaos of Omaha Beach in 2 very different ways. Don Whitehead said that no matter where somebody tried to take shelter, every time a shell landed on the ground, it was going to hit somebody. And to that, he was speaking to the congested nature of Omaha Beach in those very desperate opening hours of the landings. Meanwhile, Robert Capa took 11 photographs. He was only on the beach for 15 or 30 minutes, and then he got back on a landing craft to sign it was a bit too hot for him to be there. But among those images was the one that we see here in the background. And this has in many ways become one of the ultimate D-Day photographs. It's grainy, it's blurry. You see these waterlogged troops wearing 70 pounds of gear, trudging their way out of the bloodied surf, working their way into these landmined beaches and sands and obstacles. And as Don Whitehead very accurately conveyed, this spot was hotter than hell. And these images too have a unique cultural legacy also in the realm of Hollywood, because as Steven Spielberg was plotting out the movie Saving Private Ryan, he gave these 11 photographs to his director of cinematography, and he said, "This is what I want the opening of the movie to look like." And indeed, you can see the visual inspiration here of that 1998 movie that comes out a half century later. It's very interesting stuff. Once the beachheads are broken, once landing grounds are established, I was likewise able to discover a lot of very evocative and very moving accounts of the aftermath of the invasion. And this is where our reporter Martha Gellhorn comes back into our story. She was initially denied the opportunity to witness the invasion in the capacity of a correspondent. And what she ultimately did is that she stowed away on a British hospital ship, locked herself in the lavatory, and then once the ship set sail, she could move about the ship freely because she knew that the ship wasn't going to return just on her account. And indeed, she became the first female correspondent to step foot on Normandy soil. And she did so just as the sun was going down on June 6th. And indeed, she also beat her husband to the punch, stepping foot on Normandy's soil. But among the very compelling words that she wrote, as these long lines of wounded and maimed men are being put onto landing crafts and hospital ships, she wrote to her readers, "It will be hard to tell you of the wounded. There were so many of them. There was no time to talk. There was too much else to do." And in that moment, she put down her pen and she helped to care for this influx of wounded soldiers. And so it's a very, very telling moment where somebody was putting people before their story. And it's a very dramatic incident here that we find with Martha Gellhorn from Collier's Weekly. Ernie Pyle, who was the best known and most beloved of all war correspondents, arrived on the Normandy beaches the following day. And Ernie Pyle, who was followed by 13 million loyal readers, had just recently received the Pulitzer Prize thanks to his very endearing reporting of American troops as they were fighting in North Africa and Sicily. And in my view, what he wrote on June 7th was among his best reporting. And it transcends to almost a Shakespearean level in its poetry and in its sorrow. And what he wrote when he encountered scenes like the ones that we see here on the screen, he noted, on the beach lay expended sufficient men and mechanism for a small war. They were gone forever now, and yet we could afford it. This reveals two things to us. One, it gives us a glimpse of the American strategy to help win this war, that we were going to win it by quantity over quality, that we are going to win by sheer force of numbers and money, and that is how we will thrash the Axis into oblivion. It shows us something else too, though. It reveals to us the personal cost of D-Day. Because what Pyle does is that he describes not the corpses that are laying in the sand, but everything else that was left behind. There were toothbrushes, rosaries, combs, helmets, Jeep caps. He found a tennis racket, a guitar, a dog who was roaming the beach looking for its lost master. There were Bibles. There were diaries and journals with blank pages that would never be filled. And he called this the human litter of war. Each one of those items that had washed onto the beach or was left in the sand was representative of a young American who would never use those items ever again. And he uses lifeless, tangible items to help convey the human loss of the Normandy beachheads. And if you ever have the opportunity to read that article in its entirety, I certainly encourage you to do so, because in my view, it's really one of the best firsthand accounts of the Second World War. Really compelling stuff. And like I said, one of the other angles that my book takes that is often overlooked in the canon of D-Day and World War II literature is what's going on the home front on June 6, 1944. And at first, Americans did not really know how to react. They wondered, do we celebrate the arrival of D-Day? Do we mourn the losses of D-Day? Do we work an extra shift at the factory? Do we shut down our businesses? Do we have a parade? Do we sell war bonds? And inevitably, the answer was all of the above. And from Maine to Oregon, I found differing accounts of how Americans coped with the news of this monumental undertaking. And indeed, I would argue that this was the biggest news story of the 20th century. It was bigger than the Kennedy assassination. It was bigger than Apollo 11. Why do I feel that way? Because unlike the Kennedy assassination and Apollo 11, D-Day intimately affected every community in the United States, because every community had somebody who was participating in that massive endeavor. And that level of emotion is really unmatched by most other events in American history. And of course, by this time, with the power of radio as well, people are getting news in real time in comparison to previous wars. There were a number of photographs taken in New York City that day, though, and this one here is among my favorite. And it shows us a synagogue in New York City, and perched above the doorway are the words, "This synagogue will be open for 24 hours for special services on D-Day. All are welcome." There was this degree of unanimity, of togetherness, that we're, all in this together. There was a strong sense of the collective good, that we need to put society above ourselves. I think these are things that society today could learn a lot from in many regards by looking back on 1944. And, it was this moment of togetherness in almost all instances, regardless of how big or small a community was. And another photograph here, another one of my favorites, this one's featured on the back cover of my book. This one was taken in Times Square. All of these were, in fact. And the news of the invasion was streaming across the news boards. And people stood there for hours, hanging on every word, waiting for the vaguest of updates from the Normandy battlefront. And like I said, the reason why people were this emotional and transfixed by it is because in all likelihood, they knew somebody who was potentially there and participating in it. And so there was a degree of cautious optimism on the part of the American people that maybe, just maybe, this would be the beginning of the end, because victory was not a foregone conclusion in the year 1944. Despite all of this togetherness, we don't see it quite everywhere. And one major exception to this takes place in Cincinnati, Ohio, because there were a lot of labor strikes that took place during the war. And one of them coincided with the Normandy invasion, and it became known as the D-Day strike. This strike, however, was unlike most before. Most wartime strikes occurred because employees working in war plants felt that, they were being overworked, they weren't getting overtime, that they were being taken advantage of in the workplace. This one was a little bit different. Workers at a Wright aeronautical plant that manufactured airplane parts in Cincinnati shut down their factory because 6 African-American employees were hired to work in the metal shop. 5,000 workers walked out of the factory and shut down production at this war plant for over a week because a half a dozen people of a different skin color gained employment in that factory. And rightfully so. The Cincinnati Post called out these strikers, and it said, "You Wright workers, what will you say to the fathers and mothers of those men who fall in France?" And so there was a great sense of urgency, during this time. That idea of there being not only the battle line, but the assembly line. And now was not the time to be so petty about production over something as seemingly trivial as, racial relations, here in these sorts of plants. So that too is an often overlooked category of D-Day history that nonetheless had really important ramifications back on the home front. Arguably, though, these matters were far from the minds of troops who were on the front line. And exactly 2 weeks after D-Day, the 101st Airborne had a ceremony in the streets of Carentan, which the division had just to help liberate. And I was just in this town square a year and a half ago, and it looks exactly the same as it did in 1944. But this is where a dozen or so paratroopers were rewarded for their recent battlefield exploits. And it wasn't the ceremony itself that grabbed my attention, but rather what happened afterward. The troopers were treated to a movie. They were taken to a nearby gymnasium called Le Jean d'Arc, which also still stands right outside of Carentan. And Stars and Stripes set up a movie projector and movie screen. And they showed 1,000 paratroopers the recently released Mickey Rooney comedy called Andy Hardy's Blonde Trouble. And this moment was just so endearing to me for so many reasons. One of which is because this was the first movie in 4 years that the theater had shown that wasn't German and that the local residents were actually permitted to go see. The Germans took over their theater in 1940, and for the next 4 years, the local citizens of Carrington were not permitted to watch a movie in their own theater. And now, the theater is rather ceremoniously being handed back to them. And, you know, there's all these 19 and 20-year-old paratroopers packed in there, and they're smoking, real fire hazard probably. And, you know, they're making cat calls about the blondes who are in the movie. And they were kids again. And just for this brief moment, they could be who they once were. And even more profoundly, for many of them, it was the last movie they ever saw. Because, of course, the war is far from over. And this was just one of the best stories that I came across here. And I have great affection for this tale that I found in one of the newspapers. And indeed, 76 years later, there's all sorts of stories and lessons that we can gain from this sense of loss. And I think most poignant among them is the story of these twin brothers, Henry and Louie Piper, who were both radiomen on an LST 523, which we see here on the left. About 2 weeks after D-Day, off the shore of Utah Beach, their vessel struck an underwater mine, and it killed over 100 men aboard that ship. And Henry and Louie were among them. They were 19 years old. Twin brothers, born on the same day, dying on the same day. I cannot even begin to fathom what that does to a family. Bad enough to lose one son, but to lose twins on the same day, that creates a void in a family that can never be healed or reconciled. And Henry's body was recovered, but Louie's body was not recovered until much later. And they were buried in 2 different American cemeteries overseas as a result. But thanks to a high schooler's history project a few years ago, she was able to connect the dots. She found out that these 2 brothers were buried separately, several hundreds of miles apart. This issue was corrected. And in the spring of 2018, Henry and Louie Piper were at last reunited in the Normandy American Cemetery. And they were buried together by nieces and nephews who never even met them. This, in my mind, speaks to the power that these tales of World War II still have. Many of you are undoubtedly the children, the nieces, the nephews of World War II veterans. I would bet my money that almost every single one of you have a story or a family connection to this great conflict. And 3/4 of a century later, as we find ourselves during equally momentous times, we must ask the question, what do we owe the dead? This is certainly the question I had in mind as I roved the grounds of the Normandy Cemetery on that cold March afternoon. And in those burial grounds, as I said, there are nearly 9,400 American dead. That equates to less than 2% of the total number of Americans killed in the Second World War, and an even more minuscule proportion of the total 65 million people killed in this conflict around the globe. And I still beg the question, what do we owe the dead? And in many ways, I think General Eisenhower himself offered some very fine reflection on this. The same week of the invasion, he spoke with the press corps, and he said this. He said, "Our countries fight best when our people are best informed. I should feel disturbed if I thought that I or my public relations staff were held as anything but friends of the press. I will never tell you anything false." In Eisenhower's view, what we owed the dead was honesty, a sense of awareness, literacy about what was going on in the world, and being engaged citizens with the world as well. This was Dwight Eisenhower's view, and he tried to make good on that promise the rest of his life, including 20 years later, in the final years of his life, his generalship and his presidency behind him, he returned to the Normandy battlegrounds in 1964 with CBS journalist Walter Cronkite. And among the many places that these two men, both veterans of the Second World War, visited was the Normandy American Cemetery. And here on the lower left, we can see Cronkite with Eisenhower at that burial ground. And as he and Cronkite were sitting on the stone wall, looking over all of those tombstones, Eisenhower confessed, "I devoutly hope that we will never again have to see such scenes as these. I hope and pray that humanity will learn more than we had learned up to that time. But these people gave us a chance, and they bought time for us so that we can do better than we have before." And these 76 years later, as the last of the World War II generation leaves us, and as World War II becomes a remembered rather than a lived event, we still must ask ourselves, what are we going to do with the chance that these young men and women gave us 3/4 of a century ago? And that is the food for thought that I would like to leave you with tonight. Thank you for tuning in to my digital presentation this evening. There any questions? Is there a certain way you want to go about this?
If you have any questions or if you have any comments or things you'd like to express to Jared, please type them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen.
We could take them by voice, I suppose.
Or voice.
Too. Yeah.
All you need to do is unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Doug.
Terry Lee?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Okay, you had me off there. Let me just read a couple of questions. Jared, thank you. You couldn't hear, I was applauding there.
I saw you. Thank you.
Okay. What fourth ID unit was your grandfather in? Which unit of the 4th Division?
My grandfather was in the 20th Field Artillery Battalion, and he was a field wire chief. And so he was running telephone lines so the forward observers could connect with the gunners who were further back to the rear. And at first, I was doubtful about whether his unit was actually ashore on D-Day. But in Anthony Beevor's D-Day book, as well as in records that I found at the National Archives, the heavy artillery was indeed brought ashore on D-Day due to the speed that Utah Beach was cleared. And Utah Beach was still under enemy fire through June 7th because German soldiers still remained in such relatively close proximity. And in fact, one of the other projects that I'm working on is that my brother and I, my brother never even met our grandfather. We are working on a short film about our grandfather's experiences in the Hurtgen Forest. And we will be filming that late next year in central Pennsylvania, which actually looks a lot like the Hurtgen Forest. And so we're currently in fundraising mode for that. It has a price tag of about $70,000. We're about halfway there. So if you know any millionaires with some deep pockets and money to spare, that is
Bob's our treasurer.
yeah. That's how we wish to tell the story of our grandfather. And on that point, I suspect my brother would be very honored to speak to your group as well about his project and the history behind it.
There's another question here about why the casualties were so much higher at Omaha Beach than the other 4 beaches.
That's a great question. And when you go and visit there yourself, I think it becomes really evident. And a lot of it has to do with the geography. And I'm sure, likewise, John Mcmanus can talk about this in depth for your next meeting. But the Germans had arranged interlocking fields of fire on Omaha Beach where they were able to rain down this very lethal and effective crossfire because of the tall bluffs that were atop Omaha Beach. And it was one of the most heavily defended as well. The other beaches, while there are dunes and embankments, they really lack the tall bluffs that Omaha Beach has. And so geography played a crucial role in determining the very bloody nature of Omaha Beach. And Omar Bradley felt badly about this because he knew that the opening waves would be obliterated. And the only infantry division that had experience going into D-Day, amphibious or airborne, was the Big Red One. And that's why the Big Red One was among some of the first waves on Omaha Beach, because they had fought in North Africa, they had fought in the Mediterranean theater. And there's a very real and important purpose as to why they ended up on Omaha Beach and not elsewhere, is because they were the veterans.
Let me take a little side trip from Normandy and just ask you a little bit about, as kind of a teaser, your book that you co-wrote with Eric Dorr about Major Dick Winters. Of course, Major Winters was one of the first speakers of the Roundtable before I got involved.
Wow.
And so we have a lot of people that live around Hershey and some people who knew him personally. Just a little bit of background about that book. How did you come to write that with Eric?
Let me also grab it here off my shelf. Yeah, this book was a real passion project for us. It's called Hang Tough, the World War II Letters and Artifacts of Major Dick Winters. And as Terry said, the Gettysburg Museum of History is really one of the hidden gems of that very historic town. And if you're interested in the story behind the Band of Brothers and many other aspects of history, I would definitely encourage it. But in addition to three-dimensional tangible artifacts, Major Winters' jump uniform, his parka, his dress uniform, his pistol, all sorts of things like that. Eric, my co-author, is also in possession of a lot of correspondence, documents, and photographs that were once belonging to Major Winters. And so what we did with this book is that we transcribed the letters in their entirety. Most of them are in here. We offer context and commentary between each one, so there's a kind of cohesive storyline and timeline. And then really, one of the best things about it, if you're into militaria or collecting artifacts. We have a lot of Major Winters' original wartime memorabilia featured in these really nice color plates in the middle. Including his pistol here and his Distinguished Service Cross, which you might be able to barely make out on your screen. So like you said, we would definitely like to take up your offer to come in person once the plague is gone. And perhaps Eric could be convinced to actually bring some artifacts with him for show and tell, which would be way better in person than in this digital format. So that's my other book that just came out.
Well, it seemed to be selling well too, according to Eric. Eric, I see Eric's posts on Facebook a lot. Getting back to your D-Day book, Dispatches, I'm curious, how long did it take you to write it? I mean, to gather all that information and finally get it into publication?
From initial research to publication, it took about 2.5 years. And I really enjoyed researching it, but at one point I just had to stop myself because, I came to the conclusion that I had more than I would ever be able to use. And what I'll probably do at some point, I gathered a lot of material on hedgerow fighting as well. And so at some point in the years to come, I very well may do a sequel that looks at what happens in the weeks following D-Day itself. And it really offered me a very human and personal perspective of the invasion. And I'm an old park ranger at heart, and I often found when I was giving tours, most readers aren't interested in what regiment outflanked what regiment at this point. They want to hear about the common soldiers who made those sacrifices and made those trudges, and I try to write in that same sort of flavor. But yeah, it took about 2.5 years of researching and writing.
And you weren't getting paid for the writing at that point either, right?
No.
Couple more questions. Do you have time for a few more questions, Jerry?
I am happy to speak as long as you folks wish to keep me.
I just see a couple of other questions here. What was the most impressive source of information for the books and the stories of the soldiers? I mean, was there, you said you got it from newspapers. Was there like one, just a honey hole of information that you really appreciated?
Yeah, I would have to say out of all the newspapers that I used, that Stars and Stripes was the best, because that was a newspaper by GIs for GIs. And there's also a lot of gallows humor that's found in a lot of those articles. And it really offered me a lot of the frontline perspective that I was looking for. And the really wonderful thing about Stars and Stripes, many of you have probably seen commercials for the website called Ancestry, where you can make a family tree and all sorts of good stuff like that. Ancestry.com has almost every single issue of Stars and Stripes digitized, where you can do keyword searches and all sorts of wonderful things like that. But in that regard, what I did, I read every single page of Stars and Stripes from March 1st, 1944 to September 1st, 1944. And I just poured through it, and I made note of anything that I found of interest. So Stars and Stripes was definitely the Honeywell.
Okay. Another question, I guess, did you come across any information regarding Teddy Roosevelt Jr., who landed at Utah? In fact, he, well, you could tell me. I don't want to tell him. You're the historian. You can explain what happened, or did you come across any stories about him specifically?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just a little bit of background. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt Jr. was son of Theodore Roosevelt, the president, and that was a family where there was definitely conviction or pressure that if you were a male who was of age and fit to do so, that you better join the military and you better fight in a war if a war happens in your lifetime. And so Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was the assistant division commander of the 4th Infantry Division. And he was also the oldest participant to go ashore on D-Day. I believe he was 55 years of age at that time. and he was physically ailing. He technically should have been considered 4F. His heart was essentially a ticking time bomb. He was having many heart attacks and many strokes for the months preceding that. He suffered from arthritis. Many of you may know him by his portrayal by Henry Fonda in the movie The Longest Day, if that's a helpful point of reference. But the 4th Division landed about a half mile off course. There was a little bit of hesitation among the officers about what they should do. And Teddy Roosevelt Jr. very defiantly said, "We'll start the war from right here." And the division began to push inland. And sure enough, supplies and the other troops followed. And unfortunately, about a month later, his health caught up with him, and he suffered a fatal heart attack while he was asleep in a little Normandy church. And he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on D-Day. And there were a number of newspaper articles on him, including one surprising thing. I found out he was actually wounded on D-Day. A piece of shrapnel hit him right here on the inside of his thumb, embedded in his hand, and he just got a piece of cloth and wrapped around it, pretty much ignoring that he had just been hit by enemy shrapnel. And one of his aides, a young lieutenant by the name of Stevie Stevenson, said, "General, you're bleeding." And he said, "Oh, it's nothing. Don't worry about it. Keep moving in." And so it's little nuggets like that about famous people that really gave me a lot of joy in finding these stories.
There's a comment here too. It's regarding the 2 brothers who were killed on the landing craft. The question is, the person thought after the loss of the Sullivan brothers, I believe there are 5 Sullivan brothers who perished on the USS Juneau, that the U.S. government made a policy that brothers wouldn't be able to serve together. Why were those two serving together? Do you have any idea?
That's a great question. And, you know, if you think about all of the National Guard units and Naval Reserve units and things like that that were raised in local areas where brothers were serving together, and that the difficulty of some bureaucrat in the Pentagon trying to track them all down and trace them, I'm thinking it's just simply the logistical difficulty in finding, relations like that who were serving in the same units. And, sadly enough, as best as I could tell, and I forget where I found this, there were about 60 sets of brothers who participated in the Normandy invasion. A lot of them were in different units and were at different places at the same time, but some of them were, in fact, fighting together, including 2 other brothers, the Hoback brothers, who were from Bedford, Virginia, and they were with the 29th Infantry Division. And they landed in the same sector of Omaha Beach, and one of them was unfortunately killed. Yeah, the brothers on the ship were not the only ones.
Couple more questions. These are general Normandy related, maybe not to your book. One person wanted to know if you thought the ruse of the fictional army under Patman played an important role in the invasion's success.
Yeah, absolutely. The Phantom Army, or the Ghost Army as it is often referred, was part of a larger initiative called Operation Fortitude. And many of you have possibly seen, footage or pictures of inflatable tanks, dummy ships, all sorts of stuff like that. And a lot of those fake armies and bases were established in the north of England, much closer to the Pas de Calais, where, it's only 15 or 20 miles separating Great Britain and France. And so the Allies were reinforcing the notion that the Germans wanted to believe in. Hitler had every expectation that the invasion was going to come across to Calais, and even after the invasion started, he thought what was happening in Normandy was a diversion. And so these were people who were very stuck in their ways and stuck in their strategic attitudes, and it cost them dearly. But surely the Phantom Army in the north of England and General Patton being sent there as a decoy of sorts. Likewise, Rommel, Hitler, Model, von Rundstedt, all of these German commanders, they fully expected that Patton would be leading the invasion. And him being nowhere near the south of England made them think once again that the invasion would be coming from the northern part of England and not the southern part of England. So that was definitely a vital component.
I see two more questions here. One, it's a really lengthy one. The person took a lot of time to type
That's
it.
okay.
With all the thousands of aerial photographs that were taken leading up to Normandy, how could they not have seen the hedgerows or known about the heights and anticipated those obstacles as they moved inland?
Yeah. And certainly that was the question Omar Bradley was asking himself come early July of 1944. But, you know, with the aerial photographs, they can be somewhat deceiving, especially since they're in black and white. You lose kind of a dimension in them being black and white photos, and it differs very much. Like if you go to Google Earth or Google Maps today. And there was an assumption that these hedges, that they would be like American front yard hedges, that you would just be able to push through them. And that, you know, they were like maybe small trees or something like that. You couldn't really get a sense of the depth and the thickness of them from, you know, a quarter of a mile up in the sky. And the other difficulty that the hedgerows posed is that they weren't just hedges. They were hedges that had grown on top of old stone walls and embankments made out of rocks that were sometimes 1,000 or 2,000 years old. And so these were thick hedges deeply embedded within a rocky embankment. And it created these undulations and, you know, almost like embankments in the ground that became a sniper's delight for troops who were trying to move across. But yeah, I mean, I think that's where the Allies would have been really helped by someone who had once lived in France and had like some sort of cultural context on what the terrain was like and what the people were like. And yeah, unfortunately, the Americans and the British found that out the hard way.
I guess they didn't rely on reports from like French resistance and people that had, you know, were eager to help the Allies.
Those are questions that may not have even been asked.
Yeah, it's still a little late for that now. I have one more question
Sure.
just for the evening. Laura Pasquella wanted to know, have you given any thought to doing a book on Operation Market Garden using the same approach that you did for D-Day?
Certainly that would be feasible. And I have no doubt that I could find many good sources talking about Market Garden. I'd say the one big difference is that Market Garden was not anticipated in the same way that the Normandy invasion was. You know, the 101st Airborne, they got their mission briefing 4 days before they were going to drop into Holland. They didn't really know that it was coming. Whereas in Normandy, by contrast, you have, you know, 1.5 million allies in Great Britain for 6 months or longer beforehand. And so the level of anticipation and therefore the sources of that preparation are not as great. But certainly one could do a book similar to this on Market Garden. What I'm probably going to do, though, I'm going to be kind of returning to some of my roots here in some of my future writings. I would eventually like to revisit Gettysburg at some point. I've spent the last 4 years of my life writing about World War II. I'm a little bit World War II'd out when it comes to writing. I plan to revisit it at a future time, but for a while I might go back to the 19th century for a little bit.
And hopefully you'll find some aspect of the Battle of Gettysburg that hasn't been covered before.
I have a few ideas in mind.
Good,
Yep.
good for you. Bob, I'm done with the questions. I'll turn it back to you to wrap up.
Okay. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Jared. That was wonderful. We appreciate you joining us. Unbelievably, we had 96 participants tonight, which I know far exceeded my anticipated participation and anyone else on the board. We had lengthy discussions about whether or not we thought this format would be successful. And I'm just very, very happy the way things turned out.
That's great.
And let's hope they all buy a copy of Jared's book.
Everybody, yeah, a couple things. You can buy a copy of Jared's books. I'm sure they're available at any of your bookstores or on Amazon. Second thing, everybody has to go now to your kitchen, eat a cookie, because we unfortunately don't have any virtual cookies. All right, and then Jared, what we do is we don't pay any of our speakers, but we give them a coffee mug, a very
Okay.
priceless coffee mug, a World War II coffee mug. You have my email address. If you send me your physical address, I will be happy to send you one of these rare collector items
Okay.
that all are prized by all of our speakers.
It will be my pleasure to have a cup of Joe in honor of G.I. Joe.
Okay, great. They also work very well for bourbon.
Okay.
What this one's going to be used for in a few minutes.
Very good. And if anybody is interested in purchasing my book, I did post the Amazon link in the chat, so you can just click on that
There you go.
if you're interested. And hopefully, when the world gets a little bit healthier, I can sign that copy for you when I come to speak to your fine group in person.
That would be wonderful.
Jared, thanks again.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. You all stay safe, and we'll see you in 2021, hopefully.
All right.
Alrighty.
Happy holidays. Don't forget, we'll be back, same format in January with our speaker, Dr. John Mcmanus.